Rubio's call to Paul Biya, what it means and what it does not. That is the subject of the talking point. A phone call, ladies and gentlemen, placed on November 17 by Marco Rubio. Yes, Rubio, now wearing the hat of U.S. Secretary of State, to Cameroon's longtime ruler, Paul Biya. A call that, according to the official readout, was made to congratulate President Biya on his inauguration, not on his election. That distinction has now set the entire African political commentary class ablaze, triggered debates online, offline, in diplomatic circles, in roadside bars, and even inside the air-conditioned silence of Western think tanks. But let's break it down here tonight. Rubio congratulates Biya on inauguration, not election. Then he smoothly pivots to the deepening partnership between the USA and Cameroon to advance shared goals, including strengthening security and achieving regional peace and prosperity, end of quote. And as required by the choreography of diplomacy, Rubio commends Cameroon for being a partner in the fight against terrorism. Now, ladies and gentlemen, on the surface, this sounds like the typical diplomatic boilerplate, the kind that fits every African strongman who can still pick up a phone. But beneath that surface lies a heavy weight of contradictions, evasions, and political acrobatics that are insulting, not because they are new, but because they are so old, so predictable, and so painfully transparent. You see, the U.S. State Department is trying to thread a needle between two competing realities here, ladies and gentlemen. Number one, the United States knows Biya's legitimacy is deeply contested by Cameroonians themselves. Number two, the United States still needs to deal with Cameroon as a security partner in the volatile region. Former Under Secretary of State for African Affairs, Ambassador Thibault Nage, who is never shy about calling out Washington when it dances around African truths, told Twitter or the public to note the phrasing. U.S. is congratulating Biya on his inauguration, not his election. That is the kind of distinction diplomats make when they are trying to be clever. And Nagy followed up with what he considers a dose of realism. The U.S. must deal with the world the way it is, not how we want it. And Biya is the leader of Cameroon, end of quote. Well, yes and no. Because that is exactly where the contradiction begins. If the United States will not congratulate Biya for winning the election, because deep down they know better, then why congratulate him for an inauguration that springs from that same contested election? That is the diplomatic equivalent of refusing to acknowledge the crime while celebrating the getaway car. It's double speak. It's both sides of the mouth of diplomacy. It is a kind of semantic chess that satisfies Washington's need for deniability, but does absolutely nothing, zero, for Cameroonians seeking democracy, seeking justice, or even the simple recognition of their suffering. Secretary Rubio could have chosen silence. Silence is also policy, we know that. Silence is also a message. And in this case, silence would have allowed Cameroonians to handle their own electoral crisis without feeling like the world's most powerful democracy had just placed a reassuring hand on the shoulder of their own oppressor, Paul Biya. Because what does this call actually do? I mean, the phone call to Paul Biya from Rubio, what does it do? It emboldens the regime. It sends a signal, subtle in wording, loud in effect, that Washington is still willing to shake hands, exchange niceties, and talk counterterrorism with a government accused by its own people of kidnappings, disappearances, torture, extrajudicial killings, and dumping bodies into mass graves. That is what is going on in the regime in Cameroon for 43 years. You cannot on one hand warn about human rights violations, impose sanctions, and speak the language of democratic principles, and then, on the other hand, turn around and pass the microphone back to the same regime you claim to be holding accountable. That contradiction is no longer a footnote. It is the entire story. And speaking of terrorism, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about that word. Because in Cameroon, terrorism does not mean what Washington thinks it means. In fact, in Cameroon, Martin Luther King Jr. would be labeled a terrorist. The Tea Party, if it existed in Cameroon, would be called terrorists. Even the MAGA movement would also be labeled terrorists, according to the regime's own broad and self-serving definitions. So, when the U.S. says it wants to cooperate with Cameroon on counter-terrorism, that phrase is interpreted by Yaoundé as a blank check, a license to crush dissent, a diplomatic green light to blow the line between activism and extremism, between legitimate opposition and criminal insurgency. What Washington calls a partnership with Cameroon, the Cameroon government hears as validation. What Washington frames as regional security, Paul Biya's government weaponizes as domestic repression. That's exactly what it is. And nobody in Washington can pretend not to know this. They know. They always know. Let's widen the lens. Last August, the United States revoked TPS protections for more than 3,000 Cameroonian nationals, claiming that the humanitarian and human rights situation in Cameroon has improved. Improved? Based on what? Because on the ground, the evidence tells a different story. Cameroonians continue to flee. Entire communities continue to mourn. Young people continue disappearing into the night. And the same government that Washington just called on the phone continues to treat dissent like a disease to be eradicated. So while Washington imagines improvement, Cameroonians see danger. Cameroonians see danger. Why Washington talks of progress, Cameroonians talk of survival. And why Washington congratulates in inaugurations, Cameroonians bury their sons and their daughters. Here is another layer of the irony, ladies and gentlemen. The United States still has sanctions in place against the regime of Paul Biya. The U.S. still has sanctions against it. AGOA restrictions, military cooperation freezes, they are still in place. Measures taken under the Trump administration that have not been lifted. So how do you simultaneously maintain sanctions against a government for human rights violations and then call its leader to congratulate him for anything at all? It's like freezing someone's bank account for fraud while sending them a fruit basket to celebrate their new office, isn't it? It makes no moral, political, or diplomatic sense. No, not at all. And this is why Africans, not just Cameroonians, are tired of the West, tired of the inconsistency of the West, tired of the selective morality of the West, tired of the Western sermon about Africans being the catalyst of their own change. Why those same Western powers play chess. They play chess with African dictators for strategic convenience. How can Africans, ladies and gentlemen, how can Africans be the catalyst of their own change when the world's superpowers keep reinstalling the same engines of stagnation? How is that even possible? Let me be clear here. This is not about America choosing sides in Cameroonian politics. This is about America choosing consistency, choosing principle, and choosing credibility. Because right now, no matter how many qualifiers Washington uses, inauguration, not election, stability, not endorsement, partnership, not approval, the message received by the Biya regime is this: do what you want. Do what you want. We will still pick up the phone. That is the way Biya understands it. And the message received by Cameroonians is so different. And this is it. Your cries are noted, but your oppressor is needed. That is the message Cameroonians understand from Washington. And until the dynamic changes, Cameroonians will continue to risk deserts, oceans, jungles, detention centers, and deportation just to escape. Not because they love America more, but because their own homeland has been turned into a survival maze. And the international community keeps handing more tools, more congratulations to those who build the stagnation. So, Secretary Rubio, let me ask you directly, sir, even in this fictional setting, did you forget that U.S. sanctions remain in place in Cameroon? Did you forget why those sanctions exist, sir? Did you forget the massacres, the political prisoners, the shuttered media in Cameroon, the mass arrests, the extrajudicial executions in that country by that regime? You cannot congratulate inaugurations all you want, but you cannot congratulate legitimacy. And legitimacy is exactly what this phone call pretends not to grant, while quietly granting it anyways. To all the Western democracies, and all global powers, if you truly want Africans to solve their own problems, stop endorsing the very regimes that create those problems. If you want Cameroon to find democracy, stop normalizing its dictatorship. If you want peace, stop strengthening the hand of those who rule through fear. Because history has taught us one truth. One truth. When powerful nations speak with two voices, when powerful nations speak with two voices, authoritarian regimes hear only the one that benefits them. And Cameroonians, as always, they pay the price.